In just 27 seconds, Donald Trump turned a press conference on infrastructure into a fiery attack on Barack Obama. Millions watched as Trump's voice shook with anger, his finger stabbing the air trying to erase 8 years of history in one breath. But when Obama answered with cold precision and undeniable receipts, the question became unavoidable. What happens when rage collides with truth? In the next few seconds, you will witness the truth that they never wanted the public to know. In just 27 seconds, Donald Trump transformed the East Room of the White House into a stage for combat rather than governance. The chandeliers above glistened under the heat of television lights, bouncing reflections off marble floors that had witnessed decades of history, but rarely this kind of volatility. Rows of cameras clicked in unison, shutters snapping like gunfire as reporters settled in, expecting charts, figures, and dry explanations about infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and transit upgrades that was supposed to be the script. But the moment Trump leaned forward, finger stabbing through the air like a dagger, the script burned away and the show became his alone. Barack Obama failed, Trump growled, lips curling as if the words themselves were acidic. The declaration rippled through the room like a detonation. It wasn't delivered casually. It was aimed precise and sharpened to wound. A handful of reporters froze mid-note, pens hovering, their eyes flicking sideways to each other in disbelief. Every veteran of the press corps knew instantly this wasn't just another tangent. This was history being rewritten in real time, and they were trapped inside the first draft. Trump's hand carved the air with dismissive swats, his posture that of a man both prosecutor and executioner. His cadence was quick, almost breathless, as though he feared the weight of silence might suffocate him if he paused too long. 8 years of nothing, he spat each syllable louder than the last until his voice climbed into a register that rattled off the golden drapes and echoed in the rib cages of everyone present. The words themselves were less important than the rhythm, the performance. It was red meat tossed into the cameras, a challenge wrapped in spectacle, and the cameras, greedy and hungry, devoured every second. The East Room held its collective breath. In that moment, no one cared about potholes or contracts. Instead, the tension became almost visible, like a static charge building before a thunderstorm. A cough in the back row sounded louder than it should have, drawing a dozen irritated glances before vanishing into the silence. A younger reporter whispered, "Did he just say Obama failed?" But no one answered because everyone already knew the soundbite had detonated, and the explosion outside these walls would be seismic. Trump leaned further into the podium, his voice suddenly dropping, shifting from bombast to menace. "Look at the numbers. Look at the deals. Disasters." He drew the word out, savoring it like an actor holding the pause before a curtain drop. Theatrical, calculated, dangerous. To the untrained ear, it sounded like simple criticism. To those in the room, it was clear Trump wasn't attacking policy. He was attacking memory itself. Reporters scribbled again, some furiously, others reluctantly, knowing the lead story had just changed. Infrastructure would be relegated to the back pages. Legacy would dominate the headlines. And while Trump's supporters would cheer, his critics would sharpen knives of their own, because a battle like this could not stay confined to one afternoon. The chandeliers still glistened. The cameras still clicked. But beneath the grandeur of the White House, the air grew thick with anticipation, as though the building itself sensed the storm it was about to unleash. No one in that room left under any illusion the first strike had been thrown. The only question hanging heavy and electric was how soon and how devastating the counterstrike would be. Trump's words hung in the East Room like smoke from a gun, just fired, the echo of 8 years of nothing, still vibrating off the gilded walls. He straightened his tie jaw, locked, and scanned the room as if daring anyone to contradict him. Reporters scribbled with renewed urgency, their pens chasing after words that already felt heavier than lead. What had begun as a policy discussion now pulsed like a street fight, and Trump was swinging for legacy itself. Beyond those walls, the ripple was immediate. In a Dallas barbershop, clippers paused mid-buzz as men argued across the room, voices sharp and overlapping. "He's right," one declared, stabbing his finger at the muted television. "Obama promised change, but what did we get?" Another leaned forward, shaking his head. "You're blind." That man kept us standing when the floor was collapsing. The barber hands still listened as the debate escalated, the air thick with loyalty and resentment. In a diner outside Des Moines, forks hovered above plates of eggs and hash browns as the clip replayed on a dusty screen bolted to the wall. Farmers in weathered caps nodded along, muttering about missed opportunities, while a waitress in her 50s froze with the coffee pot in hand, eyes narrowing at the image of Trump jabbing the air. She whispered to a colleague, 8 years of nothing. My son got health care in those years. Her voice cracked quiet but fierce as the pot trembled in her grip. Meanwhile, in a high school classroom in Cleveland, students sat half-turned toward the television mounted in the corner. Their teacher had left it on during civics, thinking it would be a harmless glimpse of democracy in action. Instead, the class sat stunned as Trump's voice cut across their morning. One boy smirked, "He's got guts." A girl near the back crossed her arms, jaw tight, and muttered, "Or maybe just hate." The division played out in miniature teenagers, mirroring the fault lines of a fractured nation. Back in the East Room, Trump fed on the tension like oxygen. 8 years of weakness, he thundered, his hand pounding the podium. 8 years of decline. The reporters' faces were masks, some stone, some strained, some openly skeptical, but none could look away. They knew this wasn't about roads or bridges anymore. This was Trump serving red meat to his base, daring the rest of the country to choke on the smoke it left behind. Cable news seized the moment with ruthless precision. On Fox, pundits praised his candor, banners screaming, "Trump blasts Obama legacy." On CNN, Anderson Cooper replayed the clip in slow motion, his brow furrowed, asking his panel if this was truth or theater. MSNBC layered statistics over Trump's words, graphics, clashing with his booming rhetoric like facts colliding with fireworks. And across Twitter, hashtags split like fault lines, hashtag thanks Obama against hashtag Trump economy, each side determined to outshout the other. For Trump's supporters, it was vindication fuel for years of grievance. For his critics, it was an obsession laid bare, the fixation of a man desperate to erase the shadow of his predecessor. Every household, every bar, every feet in America seemed to pulse with the same unspoken realization: this was no longer about infrastructure. It was about ownership of memory itself. In the East Room, cameras clicked faster lenses, pulling tighter, recording every grimace, every beat of sweat, every flash of Trump's hand. Outside, in living rooms and classrooms and diners, Americans leaned closer, drawn into a battle far larger than roads or bridges. The question wasn't whether they agreed or disagreed, it was whether truth itself could survive the storm now brewing. And as the clip looped endlessly, one thought lingered like a drumbeat beneath the chaos. What happens when a man tries to rewrite history in real time? The clip spread like wildfire, igniting screens across the nation before the echoes inside the East Room had even faded. Twitter's timeline convulsed, hashtags tearing through the top trends: hashtag Obama vs. Trump, hashtag thanks Obama, hashtag Trump economy. College students in dorm rooms looped the clip again and again, some laughing, some fuming, all unable to look away. It wasn't infrastructure anymore. It was gladiatorial combat fought through sound bites and hashtags. Late-night comedians smelled blood. Stephen Colbert replayed the moment, his audience roaring as he joked. Next, he'll blame Obama for the traffic on I-95. The laugh lines echoed across living rooms, but even through the comedy, tension hummed underneath. People laughed because it was absurd, but they watched because it was dangerous. Something in Trump's delivery, raw, furious, almost unhinged, felt less like theater and more like a match dropped into gasoline. On TikTok, creators layered Trump's rant with heavy metal riffs, then cut suddenly to serene piano under Obama's calm speeches. The edits drew millions of views in hours, each one amplifying the contrast between noise and composure. Instagram filled with split-screen memes. Trump's face red with fury beside Obama, sipping water, captioned simply noise versus poise. Every scroll tightened the anticipation, as though the whole country was leaning forward, waiting for the next line in the script. In newsroom control centers from New York to Los Angeles, producers barked orders to cut footage faster than competitors' sweat on brows as they raced deadlines. Anchors sharpened their voices for prime time, the words "Trump attacks Obama" flashing across Chiron banners like emergency alerts. Even in silence, the weight of the clip was unbearable, its repetition carving the narrative deeper with each loop. Analysts whispered privately what the public already sensed: this jab was different. This time Obama would not be able to stay quiet, and yet silence stretched. From Georgetown, from Chicago, from Obama's own circle, nothing. The absence of response grew louder by the hour, filling the air with suspense. Was he ignoring Trump, dismissing him as background noise? Or was he sharpening a blade of truth that would fall with precision? America held its breath, every bar, every classroom, every diner playing the clip on repeat, eyes fixed on the void where Obama's answer should be. The nation stood on edge, laughter from late-night television fading into uneasy memes, turning into mirrors of anxiety. It wasn't just a fight between two men anymore. It was about whose version of history would survive. The fuse was burning fast, sparks flying with every retweet, every replay, every whispered debate at kitchen tables. And as silence deepened, a single question hung over the country like storm clouds. Before lightning, will silence let the lie stand, or will truth fight back? When Obama finally appeared in the story, it wasn't with the fire of a podium or the fury of a microphone. It was with silence. In a quiet office tucked inside Georgetown, the lamps cast pools of warm yellow light across stacks of papers and muted television screens. The city outside still pulsed with traffic and chatter, but inside a different energy brewed, measured, deliberate waiting. Former aides sat with phones in their hands, thumbs scrolling through timelines exploding with clips of Trump's tirade. One of them exhaled sharply, breaking the silence with three clipped words, "He went there again." The air carried the weight of recognition. This wasn't the first time Trump had swung at Obama, but tonight felt different. The clip wasn't fading. It was multiplying, mutating, burning into the bloodstream of the internet. The aides knew their old boss well enough to sense what was coming. He never rushed, never lunged at bait. Obama chose his moments the way a chess master touched a piece, slow, precise, inevitable. On one screen, Stephen Colbert's punchline about traffic on I-95 drew laughter, but the aide watching didn't smile. "It's not the joke," she murmured. "It's the silence after. People are waiting for him." Another aide looked up, eyes sharp. "And when he answers, they'll listen." The words felt less like speculation and more like prophecy. Because if Trump thrived on chaos, Obama thrived on timing, and timing was everything. Obama sat in an armchair by the window, half shadowed by the curtain's edge. His phone rested untouched on the table beside him, screen lighting up every few seconds with a new headline, a new clip, another hashtag climbing the ranks. His posture was calm, almost too calm, as though the storm outside the walls was a distant hum. To those watching him, it was infuriating and reassuring all at once, this ability to absorb chaos without flinching. Everywhere else, America was choking on noise. News anchors barked, Twitter feeds raged, pundits dissected every gesture Trump made in the East Room. But here in Georgetown, the contrast was stark. Obama's silence became its own kind of weapon, sharp as any statement he could have issued. Each second he didn't speak stretched the tension, further pulling the nation tighter into suspense. It was less the absence of sound than the anticipation of thunder after lightning. The aides debated timing, voices hushed but urgent. If we wait too long, the lie grows. If we move too fast, it feels defensive. The room filled with possibilities, strategies, counter-strategies. But they all orbited the same central truth. When Obama spoke, the nation listened. They had seen it before, how a single line delivered in calm precision could cut deeper than hours of shouting. That was his gift and his curse. Every silence promised an answer, and every answer carried weight. Obama finally leaned forward, clasping his hands, his expression unreadable but steady. He didn't need to say a word. His aides quieted instantly, watching as if waiting for a conductor's baton. His eyes drifted to the glowing screen where Trump's face froze, mid-shout, finger stabbing the air. The contrast was already visible: chaos versus composure, rage versus restraint. Obama's silence wasn't emptiness. It was power winding tighter, a bowstring being drawn back. And as the city buzzed outside and the nation leaned in, one question hung unspoken in that small Georgetown office, heavy enough to suffocate the air itself. How long can silence hold before precision strikes back? When Obama's response finally came, it wasn't wrapped in fury, it was draped in numbers. The statement arrived like a blade sliding quietly from its sheath, sharp and undeniable. Anchors leaned forward in their studios as the words scrolled across screens. The Recovery Act of 2009 invested $48 billion into transportation projects, over 40,000 miles of road, improved nearly 27,000 bridges strengthened. That work laid the foundation for everything built since. No shouting, no theatrics, just steel-hard facts carved into sentences. The silence that followed was different this time. In living rooms, in diners, and classrooms, people froze, eyes glued not to a man's raised finger, but to receipts that spoke for themselves. A factory worker in Detroit wiped grease from his hands reading the headline on his cracked phone screen and muttered 40,000 miles. That's real. A retired teacher in Phoenix whispered to her husband, "That's the road we drive every week." Numbers cold and unyielding were suddenly alive, pulsing with the weight of lived truth. In newsrooms, the contrast became ammunition. Networks played Trump's furious clip, his voice booming, 8 years of nothing. Then split-screen Obama's calm statement rolled with quiet precision. One side roared, the other recorded. The impact was brutal in its simplicity. Viewers didn't need commentary. The side-by-side comparison told the entire story. Social media erupted with a different kind of energy. On Twitter, a meme began spreading like wildfire. Trump red-faced mid-shout, caption, "Receipts beside him." Obama's words stamped over a highway construction photo. "Receipts don't shout, they prove." Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times, each retweet another nail hammered into Trump's attempted narrative. On TikTok, creators layered epic orchestral music over Obama's numbers, cutting back to Trump's rant like a villain in a film undone by evidence. The power of the response was not in its volume, but in its restraint. Obama hadn't raised his voice yet. The numbers struck like thunder after lightning. Every statistic became a weapon, each mile of road a rebuttal, each bridge repaired a line of defense. The facts weren't abstract, they were concrete under America's wheels, under its feet, woven into its daily life. Where Trump offered anger, Obama offered proof, and proof lingered. By evening, headlines shifted. "Obama fires back with facts," read the Associated Press. CNN's banner declared, "Receipts over rhetoric." Even Fox News, though cautious, flashed the words, "Obama cites record projects" during its panel debates. The nation wasn't watching a shouting match anymore. It was watching a clash of truth versus noise, and the balance had tilted. And as the statement ricocheted across screens, across conversations, across hearts, the emotional current was undeniable empowerment. People felt steadied, grounded, reminded that history wasn't just words flung in anger. It was numbers, roads, bridges, proof you could drive across. Proof that didn't shout but proved. The moment the split screen hit the airwaves, the contrast was devastating. On the left, Donald Trump, face-flushed finger, stabbing the air mouth, frozen mid-yell. On the right, Barack Obama, seated calmly, sipping a glass of water during a past town hall, his expression steady, almost bored. The images didn't need narration. Viewers felt the revelation instantly, like being jolted awake from a dream. News anchors leaned into the silence, letting the visuals speak. "Noise versus poise," one murmured, and the phrase caught fire across social media within minutes. Families in living rooms stared, some chuckling softly, others nodding with slow recognition. It was cinematic in its simplicity, chaos on one side, composure on the other, as though America had been handed two mirrors and told to choose which reflection it wanted to follow. In a Kansas diner, a farmer set down, his fork, eyes locked on the television. "That's it right there," he said to no one in particular. One screams, the other shows he doesn't have to. Across the country, in Los Angeles, a college student clipped the segment, layering dramatic strings under the split screen. The video racked up 1 million views overnight, comments flooding in. "This is the election in a single image." The edits spread like sparks, each one amplifying the gulf between rage and restraint. Back in Washington, Trump's aides watched the coverage in grim silence. The louder their boss shouted, the smaller he looked beside Obama's unbothered calm. One advisor muttered, "We can't win this comparison." Another just shook his head, staring at the looping footage. In politics, perception was everything, and the perception now was that Obama didn't even need to speak to win the moment. The revelation hit ordinary Americans hardest. Parents explained it to their children at dinner tables. One's trying to prove he's strong. The other doesn't need to. In break rooms, workers replayed the clip on their phones, passing it around like evidence in a trial everyone had already decided. The power of the image wasn't just in its humor, it was in its clarity. People weren't laughing at Trump. They were awakening to the contrast. By midnight, the meme had become unavoidable. Side-by-side frames stamped with captions, noise versus poise, shouts versus receipts, chaos versus clarity. It was everywhere on Twitter, on Facebook, even projected onto a wall in Brooklyn by activists armed with a projector and a sense of theater. The narrative had escaped the hands of politicians and entered the bloodstream of culture. And once there, it couldn't be contained. As screens flickered with a split image across America, one truth grew louder than any microphone strength wasn't measured by decibels, but by steadiness. Trump's volume filled rooms, but Obama's clarity filled minds. And the nation caught between two reflections found itself asking the question that lingered long after the split screen faded. Does real strength lie in volume or in clarity? The split screen had burned itself into America's memory, but the true battle wasn't on cable news. It was in the quiet corners of daily life. In a modest kitchen in Spokane, a retired teacher lowered her coffee mug onto the table with a soft thud. Her husband looked up from the newspaper, but she didn't need to explain. The television played Trump's clip again, his voice booming, 8 years of nothing. She shook her head slowly, voice sharp as chalk on a blackboard. That man can't go a week without mentioning Obama. In Detroit, the night shift at an auto plant spilled into the break room booths, scraping the concrete floor as workers clustered around a flickering flat screen mounted on the wall. The clip looped Trump jabbing his finger, Obama's calm numbers flashing alongside. A heavy-set mechanic grease still on his arms leaned against a locker and muttered, "Feelings don't build bridges, facts do." Across from him, another worker snorted, "Facts don't feed families if they don't come with jobs." The room pulsed with argument, every man and woman there drawing on their own scars of layoffs, repairs, long hours. Their words cut deeper than any pundit's polished analysis. In a diner outside of Cleveland, the breakfast rush slowed as the televisions over the counter replayed the headlines. Waitresses in aprons poured coffee absent-mindedly, eyes fixed on the screen. At the corner booth, two veterans argued quietly, one insisting Trump was finally telling hard truths, the other shaking his head, pointing at the numbers Obama had cited. "I drove over one of those bridges just last week," he said, his voice trembling with conviction. "That's not nothing. That's something I can see with my own eyes." The other veteran fell silent, chewing slowly, gaze locked on the swirling coffee in his cup. In Los Angeles, a group of students crowded around a laptop in a noisy cafeteria, TikTok edits blaring through tinny speakers. They laughed at the memes, but beneath the laughter was a thread of unease. "It's funny," one girl said, "but it's also kind of sad. We're arguing about who yells louder while the roads outside our school are full of potholes." Her friends nodded, the humor dissolving into something heavier, something that felt uncomfortably close. Across America, the echoes multiplied. Barber shops, factory floors, classrooms, kitchens. Trump's roar and Obama's calm were no longer just political soundbites. They were conversation starters, wedge drivers, truth tellers, lies exposed. It was no longer about who won the argument on television, but who owned the truth in everyday lives. And in those spaces far from Washington, far from marble halls and chandeliers, the voices of ordinary people carried an unexpected power. By evening, the retired teacher in Spokane turned off the television, staring out the window at the fading light. "It's always the same story," she whispered, more to herself than to her husband. "One man shouts, the other proves, and the rest of us are left to decide which one we want to believe." The debates in diners and factories were only the surface. The true inferno raged online. By nightfall, TikTok was ablaze with edits that turned politics into performance art. Trump's furious rant blasted over distorted heavy metal riffs, his finger jabbing in slow motion, then cut. The scene shifted to Obama's calm numbers, rolling across the screen as a soft piano melody played in the background. Millions watched in silence, the transition hitting harder than any punchline, the contrast etched into their minds like a film trailer gone viral. On Twitter, humor became its own weapon. One viral post read, "Trump blames Obama for everything." Next, he'll say Obama invented potholes. Within hours, it had hundreds of thousands of likes replies, stacked like dominoes of sarcasm. Another user quipped, "Breaking Obama also responsible for traffic on I-95." The exhaustion beneath the laughter was obvious. People weren't just mocking Trump. They were sighing through the absurdity, using humor as a shield against fatigue. Instagram feeds filled with memes crafted at lightning speed. Split screens of Trump yelling with captions like "noise" stood beside Obama's steady gaze labeled notes. A particularly viral image showed Trump mid-shout next to a bridge with the caption, "This doesn't exist according to him." The simplicity stung. Each repost carried not just comedy, but quiet rebellion, a refusal to accept noise as truth. Even late-night comedians leaned in, amplifying the chaos into cultural theater. Jimmy Fallon mimicked Trump's voice, shouting, "Obama invented potholes," while the crowd erupted. Trevor Noah shook his head on The Daily Show, muttering, "If Obama really built nothing, then who put up all those orange cones I've been stuck behind for years?" The audiences laughed, but the laughter was edged with exhaustion. People weren't just entertained, they were drained, desperate for clarity in a storm of noise. But beneath the jokes, tension hummed like an undercurrent. Every meme, every punchline, every viral clip carried the same silent plea, "Somebody answer this." America laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that comes when nerves are frayed, when absurdity feels too close to collapse. The firestorm wasn't just about who won or lost, it was about how long the country could live in a cycle of chaos before truth had to fight back. In living rooms, teenagers showed their parents the memes, chuckling, while their fathers shook their heads. In office break rooms, workers laughed between bites of sandwiches, then fell quiet when the screen replayed Trump's words without the joke attached. The humor gave momentary relief, but it also deepened the hunger for something real, for proof, for receipts. And as the memes multiplied, the hashtags climbed, and the edits looped endlessly across screens, the nation leaned forward, caught between exhaustion and anticipation. The laughter was loud, but the silence underneath it was louder. And the question grew sharper with every scroll: how long can a country laugh off noise before clarity demands its turn? The West Wing was suffocating under the weight of numbers it couldn't spin. Aides crowded into a narrow office, the glow of half a dozen television screens painting their faces pale. Every channel was the same: the Gallup poll, the split screen, the verdict that 58% of Americans now saw Obama as more presidential than the man in power. One aide muttered under his breath, voice cracking, "We're getting hammered out there." The words hung heavy, a death sentence none of them wanted to hear spoken aloud. On the largest screen, the meme replayed again and again. Trump mid-shout, his mouth contorted, finger stabbing forward, contrasted with Obama sipping a glass of water, unbothered calm. The caption stamped across the image read, "Noise versus poise." 500,000 likes and climbing by the minute. An aide slammed his fist onto the table, the sound startling the room. "We can't stop it. It's everywhere." His voice was thick with dread, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The room buzzed with frantic energy. Staffers rifled through folders, tossed out half-baked strategies, all drowned by the relentless loop of screens. Every attempt to frame a new narrative sounded weaker than the last. One suggested pivoting to jobs numbers, another muttered about foreign policy, but no one believed the distractions would stick. The contrast was too clear, too cinematic. For every shout Trump had delivered, Obama now stood taller in silence, and the American people had already chosen which image they wanted burned into memory. Phones buzzed constantly, screens lighting up with fresh updates, Twitter accounts climbing, TikTok edits, spreading late-night clips replaying. One aide groaned, dragging his palms down his face. "It's like trying to fight a hurricane with an umbrella." Another whispered, "No, it's worse. We are the hurricane, and people are tired of the storm." The admission fell into silence, the kind of silence that carried more dread than shouting ever could. In the corner, the chief of staff leaned against the wall, arms, folded eyes locked on the looping meme. He didn't speak, but his expression said it all. This was no longer about strategy. It was about survival. The White House had become a bunker, and outside the battlefield was already lost. Every aide in the room knew what Trump would demand when he stormed in a counterattack, a new headline: chaos, to bury the truth. But beneath their frantic movements, beneath their whispered strategies, the dread had already settled in like smoke after an explosion. The televisions flickered again, showing another panel of analysts dissecting the poll numbers. Their voices droned, but the images screamed, Obama calm, Trump furious. And in that small, crowded room inside the most powerful house in the world, the aides felt powerless. The truth was simple and brutal. Perception had shifted, and no amount of shouting could drag it back. The room still hummed with dread when Kellyanne Conway pushed through the door, her heels clicking sharp against the tile like gunshots in a tunnel. She didn't wait to sit. She planted herself at the head of the table, eyes blazing at the exhausted staffers huddled around glowing screens. For a moment, no one dared to speak. The only sound was the looping broadcast of Obama's calm voice, paired with Trump's furious gestures. Then Conway cut through the silence with words that landed like a gavel. We can't win the comparison. We need a new headline big enough to bury this. The aides shifted uneasily, exchanging glances that betrayed the fear simmering just beneath their professional mass. They had all thought it, but hearing it spoken aloud was different. It made the nightmare real. One staffer stammered, "We could pivot to foreign policy. Maybe China, maybe tariffs." Conway's glare shut him down instantly. "No," she snapped. "Distraction isn't enough. This isn't about issues. This is about images. And right now, the country sees him as calm and presidential, while our boss looks desperate." The last word trembled with danger because in that room, to call the president desperate was to risk everything. On the television, the meme flashed again. Trump mid-yell beside Obama sipping water. The caption burned across the screen, "Noise versus poise." The likes had soared past $700,000. Conway's voice lowered, but the urgency in it cut sharper than any shout. "Every time that image plays, we lose ground. We have to bury it fast." Her words left no room for argument. The silence that followed was thick like the air before a storm pressing on every chest in the room. Ideas came in bursts, frantic and hollow. What about immigration? What if we push a new executive order? Maybe a rally big crowd shots. Each suggestion was swatted down almost as soon as it left a mouth. They weren't headlines, they were bandages on a wound bleeding too fast. Conway paced her fingers, tapping the table like a ticking clock. The aides could feel it time wasn't on their side. The longer Obama's calm lingered in the public's mind, the deeper the wound cut. Finally, Conway stopped pacing, her reflection caught in the darkened window. "It has to be something bigger than him," she said softly, almost to herself. "Something that forces every camera to turn away, something so loud that even his silence can't compete." Her words chilled the room. Fear twisted in the aides' stomachs, not just fear of failure, but fear of what she might be willing to unleash. The televisions flickered again, showing analysts repeating the poll numbers with grim certainty. Obama's calm presence filled the screen like gravity. Around the table, no one spoke. The staffers sat trapped in the knowledge that they were no longer strategizing to win, they were strategizing to survive. And in that suffocating quiet, the question none of them dared to say aloud screamed inside every mind. What kind of storm would they have to summon to bury the truth? The door slammed open so hard the frame rattled, and every head in the room snapped toward it. Donald Trump stormed in red tie, swinging face flushed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. His voice cracked like thunder. "What's this? I'm hearing about Obama winning." The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation hurled into the air, daring anyone to answer. The aides shrank back instinctively, shoulders tightening as if the force of his anger alone might scorch them where they sat. Trump's eyes darted to the televisions on the wall, every screen replaying the same unbearable truth. Obama's calm words, Trump's furious finger side by side in endless loop. His jaw clenched, lips trembling with rage as he watched his own face contort in anger, while Obama sipped water like a man untouched by the storm. "Turn that off," he barked, but no one moved fast enough. His voice rose higher, edged with desperation. "Shut it off now." An aide fumbled with their remote hands, shaking the silence that followed heavier than the noise itself. For years, Trump's fury had been his weapon, commanding, intoxicating, terrifying. But tonight, his anger looked different. It wasn't powerful, it was cornered. His words, once capable of drowning out entire news cycles, now seemed to collapse in on themselves, swallowed by the calm shadow of a man no longer even in office. The aides felt it too, the shift in gravity. His roar no longer shook the room, it only revealed the cracks. He paced like a caged animal, hair disheveled, movements sharp and erratic. They're saying he looks presidential. He's not even in the White House. His hands slammed against the table papers, scattering like frightened birds. I built this economy, I fixed the mess, and now they're saying he wins. His voice cracked on the last word, a note of fear piercing through the fury. For the first time, his anger didn't sound like dominance. It sounded like panic. The aides avoided his eyes, staring at their notes, their phones anywhere but him. One risked a glance and instantly looked away, struck by the sight of their leader unraveling before them. The authority that once radiated from his outbursts had curdled into something weaker, almost pathetic. His chaos, once magnetic, now looked small compared to Obama's stillness. The room knew it. Trump knew it. And the knowledge gnawed at him like acid. He stopped pacing, chest heaving, eyes wild, searching for someone to blame. But the silence offered nothing back, no enemy in the room to lash out at, no spin strong enough to erase the image that had already cemented in the public mind. For a man who thrived on control through chaos, the calm had beaten him before he even realized the fight was over. And as he stood there, fists trembling, surrounded by aides who no longer saw strength in his fury, one question bled into the silence, unspoken, yet undeniable: what happens when a man who thrives on chaos finds himself outmatched by calm? The clash in Washington no longer belonged to politicians or pundits. It belonged to the people living its echoes. In a small-town cafe in Iowa, retirees gathered at their usual corner table, steaming mugs of coffee between them, the television muted above the counter. One man adjusted his cap, eyes fixed on the silent split-screen replay. I don't agree with Obama, he admitted, his voice gravelly with years of farm dust, but he doesn't lose his cool. The others nodded slowly, as though acknowledging a truth they'd resisted, but could no longer deny. Across the state, in a modest living room, with toys scattered on the floor, parents leaned on the edge of a couch while their children watched the same looping clip. Trump's finger jabbed through the screen, voice raised before cutting to Obama's calm statement. The father glanced at his son and spoke carefully, his tone carrying the weight of a lesson. One sounds like a fighter, he said, the other like a teacher. His wife added softly, and teachers build fighters, just break. The children listened wide-eyed, as though history itself was being explained in their own home. At a union hall in Ohio, steelworkers crowded around a projector, flashing the poll numbers that had stunned the nation. The chatter was low, heavy, punctuated by the occasional grunt or shake of the head. One man, his hands scarred from decades at the mill, finally broke the silence. I voted for Trump, he confessed, but I can't ignore what I see. Anger's cheap. Calm takes strength. The room murmured with agreement, reluctant yet undeniable, the kind of consensus forged not in slogans, but in hard-earned clarity. In classrooms across the country, teachers used the moment as a living civics lesson. Students debated loudly, some defending Trump's fire, others pointing to Obama's quiet proof. A history teacher in Phoenix styled the noise with a single question: which voice do you trust to lead you through a storm, the one that shouts over the thunder or the one that steadies the ship? The silence that followed was more telling than any answer, the weight of the question pressing on young minds still forming their view of leadership. Even in kitchens and barbershops, the conversations carried the same current. The argument wasn't about policy anymore. It was about character, about the kind of presence people wanted shaping their future. For the first time in years, the debate felt less like a partisan brawl and more like a collective soul-searching. Ordinary voices, stripped of spin, were cutting deeper than any headline or analyst ever could. And as night fell across, America, televisions glowed in living rooms, phones buzzed on counters, and the nation whispered its verdict in unison. Clarity mattered more than chaos. Yet the question lingered in the quiet spaces between those conversations, echoing like a pulse in the long run. Will America choose the fighter who shouts or the teacher who steadies? The internet distilled the clash into a single line, sharp as a verdict: Trump gave us fire, Obama gave us water. Guess which one put the other out? The phrase spread like sparks across every platform, printed on memes, whispered in late-night shows, scrawled onto posters at coffee shops. It captured what statistics and speeches could not: the elemental simplicity of the showdown. Fire against water, rage against calm. And everyone knew how that story ended. In Brooklyn, activists projected the phrase across a brick wall, the words glowing against the night sky as cars slowed to take photos. In Los Angeles, a TikTok creator set the line over footage of fire hoses blasting flames, then cut to Obama's measured words rolling calmly like a river. The clips surged to millions of views in hours, comment sections overflowing with the same cathartic truth: water extinguishes fire. It wasn't comedy anymore. It was resolution. Cable news anchors seized on the phrase, each repeating it with the cadence of revelation. Trump gave us fire, one intoned gravely. Obama gave us water. And tonight, it seems clear which one endured. The panelists nodded, some grudgingly, others with relief, as though they had finally been given language for the feeling that had gripped the nation all week. The image of Trump's clenched fists and Obama's folded hands now crystallized into metaphor, too powerful to ignore. In a church basement in Atlanta, elders gathered for a weekly Bible study paused to discuss the phrase. One woman, her hands folded neatly in her lap, said softly, "Fire burns quick, water lasts." Heads around the table nodded, murmurs of agreement filling the room. It was more than politics, it was parable, and the lesson rang deeper than polls or punditry could ever reach. At a family dinner in Arizona, a teenage daughter repeated the line aloud, testing its rhythm. Her father smiled faintly, setting down his fork. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole thing right there." His voice carried a note of release, as though something that had gnawed for years finally had words. The table fell into thoughtful silence, each family member feeling the same catharsis, the same clarity. The phrase pulsed across America like a chant weaving through conversations, flashing across screens, echoing in rallies and living rooms alike. Trump's fury, once so dominant, now looked like sparks scattered in the wind, fading into smoke. Obama's calm, once underestimated, had become the steady current carrying the nation forward. Water didn't need to roar, it only needed to flow. And as the country exhaled under the weight of the metaphor, the catharsis was undeniable. Fire had raged loud and consuming, but water had smothered it without breaking a sweat. The lesson lingered in the air, heavy yet liberating. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in the blaze that burns brightest, but in the quiet current that never dies. By the end of the week, the storm had found its shape in a single phrase: truth doesn't scream. It trended across Twitter, scrolled across TikTok captions, even appeared in chalk on sidewalks outside high schools. It was less a slogan than a reckoning, a distilled lesson from the clash that had gripped America. Where Trump's fury had roared, Obama's restraint had whispered, and somehow the whisper was louder. On the evening, news anchors repeated the words with solemn weight, each syllable falling like a gavel. Truth doesn't scream, one declared, as footage rolled of bridges, repaired highways, rebuilt evidence that required no raised voice to defend itself. Analysts didn't argue, they simply nodded, because the facts were there, concrete and undeniable. The story had shifted from spectacle to substance, and in that shift the country exhaled. In Chicago, a group of college students painted the phrase across a bedsheet and hung it from their dormitory window, the letters glowing red under streetlights. Cars honked as they passed, some in support, some in protest, but all acknowledging the message that refused to be ignored. In Phoenix, a grandmother tapped the phrase into a Facebook post, writing beneath it, "It's how I raised my children," actions louder than noise. Her words drew hundreds of comments, neighbors and strangers alike echoing the sentiment. The White House could not bury it. Every attempt to create new headlines was drowned out by the meme, the chant, the truth that had already rooted itself in the public's mind. Trump's anger replayed endlessly, but each replay weakened him further, reminder not of strength, but of loss. Meanwhile, Obama's calm continued to grow, not because he shouted for it, but because silence gave it power. The comparison was no longer a clip, it was a cultural judgment etched into memory. In living rooms, parents repeated the phrase to their children as though it were a moral handed down through generations. In classrooms, teachers scrawled it on whiteboards, asking their students what it meant to them. And in break rooms and factories, workers carried it in their conversations, stripping away the noise until all that remained was clarity. Truth doesn't scream, they said, and heads nodded because they had felt the difference for themselves. By Sunday, the phrase was everywhere, on bumper stickers, handmade posters, at rallies, whispered like a prayer at dinner tables. It wasn't about Obama versus Trump anymore. It was about the kind of leadership Americans wanted to see reflected back at them, the kind of voice they wanted steadying the storm. And as the week's chaos settled into memory, one question lingered in the silence that followed. Do we value leaders who fight loudest or those who steady the storm? By Monday morning, the nation's papers and networks had already rendered their judgment. Editorials spilled across front pages with a clarity as sharp as the split screen itself. Contrast is everything. Obama steadied, Trump shouted. The words framed not just the moment, but the essence of the clash, carving the lesson into headlines that would outlast the memes. What began as a soundbite had hardened into narrative, and the narrative was brutal in its simplicity. On Fox News, the spin was immediate. Their Chiron blared Obama strikes back. The framing turned restraint into aggression, attempting to paint the calm statement as a partisan counterpunch. Hosts debated whether Obama had stepped out of line, whether a former president should even respond. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the footage told another story, the side-by-side of a man raging and a man proving a contrast even Fox couldn't bury. MSNBC seized the moment with surgical precision. Anchors leaned forward, voices hushed as they repeated the phrase that had already defined the week, clarity versus chaos. They replayed the clips with haunting piano, underscoring Trump's tirade, then cut to Obama's steady delivery of facts. The contrast hit like a cinematic montage, less analysis than revelation. The audience didn't need to be convinced. They felt the difference deep in their bones. Editorial boards across the country echoed the same theme. The Boston Globe declared, "In American politics, perception is power, and perception has shifted." The Chicago Tribune wrote, "Strength is not who yells loudest, but who steadies longest." Even regional papers far from Washington carried the story on their front pages, weaving the verdict into small-town diners and morning commutes. The recognition was collective. Obama had turned silence into gravity, and Trump's roar into static. Inside cable studios, panels dissected the fallout with the air of surgeons examining a body after collapse. Charts compared poll numbers, clips replayed in slow-motion, analysts pointing at Trump's red face beside Obama's calm stillness. "This is not about policy anymore," one commentator said flatly. "This is about posture." The sentence landed like a gavel, stripping away the last illusions of substance. What America saw wasn't legislation, it was character. The recognition spread beyond journalists. In classrooms, professors clipped the coverage into lectures on leadership and rhetoric. In churches, pastors quoted the editorials, turning the clash into sermon material. And in coffee shops, ordinary Americans read aloud from the headlines, repeating the lesson as though it were scripture. Contrast is everything. The power of the moment wasn't that Obama shouted louder, but that he didn't need to. By week's end, the media's autopsy was complete, and the cause of death was clear. Trump's fury, once a weapon, had been undone by its own excess. Obama's calm, once underestimated, had become a force that no poll, no pundit, no spin could erase. The recognition was universal, and it lingered with the weight of inevitability in this clash. Chaos burned out, but clarity endured. By Sunday morning, the story had left the front pages and entered the pulpits. In churches across the country, pastors wove the clash into sermons that reached beyond politics, striking chords of timeless wisdom. One preacher in Atlanta stood before his congregation, voice resonant under vaulted ceilings. Some shout to be heard. Others speak softly yet move nations. The words rolled through the sanctuary like thunder subdued into rain, and the heads of young and old bowed not in partisanship, but in recognition. In a small church in Iowa, the pews creaked as farmers and their families leaned forward, listening as their pastor spoke plainly. "Strength is not the fire that consumes," he said, "but the water that endures." Mothers nudged their children, whispering the line into their ears, passing it like an heirloom. The clash between Trump and Obama became less about two men and more about the kind of voice one should carry into life. Generational divides softened under the weight of these lessons. In Detroit, a grandfather turned to his teenage grandson after the sermon, his voice rough but steady. "You don't need to out-yell the world to change it. You just need to stand your ground with truth." The boy nodded slowly, storing the words like ammunition for a future he didn't yet fully understand. Wisdom passed forward, bridged decades in a single pew. Across the country, living rooms became classrooms of their own. Parents replayed the clips on television, pausing to explain the difference between rage and resolve. One mother told her daughter, "Do you see one man fought for attention? The other let the facts do the fighting." The child asked, "Which one wins?" The mother smiled faintly. "The one we remember for the right reasons." These quiet conversations carried more weight than editorials because they shaped not opinion, but inheritance. In universities, professors echoed the same lessons, weaving the moment into lectures on leadership. Students scribbled notes as one professor wrote on the board, "Noise fades, clarity stays." The phrase lingered in the lecture hall long after class ended, scrawled into margins, whispered between friends as if it were both mantra and challenge. For the younger generation, the clash became a test of values, what kind of leadership they would demand and what kind they would reject. Even on street corners, elders took the chance to pass the wisdom on. In Harlem, an old man leaned on his cane, surrounded by children listening with wide eyes. "Don't mistake shouting for strength," he told them. "A hurricane makes noise, but it is the steady river that shapes the land." The children nodded, their faces reflecting both curiosity and awe, the metaphor etched into their memory more vividly than any headline. By evening, the nation's conversations had shifted from outrage to reflection. The clash no longer lived only on screens. It lived in sermons and stories and whispers across generations. What had begun as noise and fury had transformed into something more enduring, a lesson handed down, a warning etched into memory. And as the week closed, America found itself holding a quieter but sharper truth, that wisdom is not measured by who shouts the loudest, but by whose words last long enough to be repeated. By Monday evening, the coverage no longer asked who had won the clash. The debate had shifted into something deeper, something harder to measure with polls alone. Analysts filled the screens, their voices steadier than usual, as if the gravity of the week demanded precision. Perception is power. One declared, his words echoing through studios from New York to Los Angeles. And in this clash, Obama grew taller. Trump looked smaller. The phrase became its own refrain, repeated by pundits and whispered in households alike. Viewers didn't need charts to see it. The proof was in the images, replayed over and over. One man red-faced and raging. The other calm and composed, the weight of his words carried not by decibels, but by clarity. The contrast was cinematic, like the hero and villain of a story, revealed not through dialogue, but through presence. In Washington, policy veterans shook their heads with a rare candor. "We've never seen this before," one admitted. A former president redefining the standard while the current one unravels. The thought carried a sting because it wasn't about partisanship, it was about the nature of leadership itself. What does it mean to be presidential? For decades, the answer had been debated in op-eds in classrooms. But this week it was written in expressions, gestures, silences. At a roundtable in Boston, historians leaned into their microphones, voices calm but edged with awe. Trump has always relied on Volume 1 explained. But presidential leadership isn't measured by noise. It's measured by steadiness. The panel nodded, the sentence landing like an epilogue. It wasn't that Obama had shouted down his rival, he hadn't. It was that he didn't need to. The steadiness itself became the definition. Out in America, the lesson found fertile ground. In a barber's chair in Chicago, a man told his stylist, "I'm tired of the yelling. I just want someone who acts like an adult." The barber nodded, razor buzzing softly, as though the hum itself symbolized the steadiness missing from politics. In a diner in Oklahoma, a group of farmers repeated the line they'd heard on television. He grew taller. Trump looked smaller. They didn't speak it with triumph or anger, just recognition. At universities, the question became homework. A professor scrawled it on the board in bold chalk. What defines presidential leadership? Students argued back and forth, some insisting it was strength, others pointing to empathy, still others to clarity. But as the debate wound down, the quiet answer emerged from the back of the room. It's steadiness. The room fell silent because everyone knew the truth of it. They had seen it unfold in real time. Even late-night television, which thrived on exaggeration, struggled to outdo the reality. Hosts cracked jokes, but the punchlines landed with less force than the simple truth. Obama didn't need the Oval Office to look presidential. He only needed to remain calm while Trump unraveled. It was a lesson too sharp to laugh away, and audiences felt it in the pit of their stomachs. By the close of the week, the verdict had crystallized. Obama had left office years ago, but in one clash, he reclaimed the mantle of what it meant to look and feel presidential. Trump, still in power, had shrunk before the cameras undone by his own reliance on rage. And as the echoes of the week faded into memory, one question lingered heavy in the national conscience like thunder. After lightning is presidential leadership measured by noise or by steadiness? The headlines faded, but the echoes of the clash refused to die. Families carried it into their kitchens, replaying the split screen in conversations between bites of dinner. Workers brought it up in break rooms, glancing at their phones between shifts, shaking their heads at how one man shouted while the other simply proved. Students scribbled the phrase, "Truth doesn't scream," into notebooks as if it were part of their curriculum. The story no longer belonged to politicians, it belonged to the people who lived its shadow. In a small-town library in Ohio, parents sat with their children for evening reading hour, but the conversation drifted back to the week's events. A mother explained gently. One leader raised his voice, the other raised his proof. Her child tilted her head, whispering, "Which one's stronger?" The question hung in the air longer than the storybook that followed, a reminder that the clash had planted seeds that would outlast the news cycle. At a construction site in Texas, men in hard hats leaned against beams, scrolling headlines during lunch. The poll numbers had already slipped from front pages, but the memory of them still burned in their minds. One muttered, "Doesn't matter what side you're on, everybody saw the same thing." His coworker nodded, adding, "Noise fades. Work stays." Their words cut with a clarity no pundit could manufacture, forged in sweat and dust. In classrooms, teachers used the contrast as a lesson in character. History wasn't just in textbooks anymore. It was unfolding in real time on screens. A civics teacher in North Carolina paused mid-lecture, replaying the clips for her students. Leadership, she told them, is not how loud you shout, but how long your words last. The silence in the room was heavy, charged with the recognition that they were learning not just about politics, but about life. The story lingered in places where news usually disappeared quickly. Barbershops, where arguments flared and cooled, carried the phrase noise versus poise like gospel. Cafes pinned printed memes to bulletin boards, the caption, "Trump gave us fire." Obama gave us water, taped beside local event flyers. Even in silence, the images stayed. Trump red-faced, Obama calm, and the contrast repeated itself like an echo bouncing across the nation. By week's end, the clash had already been archived by networks, but it hadn't been archived in people's minds. It slipped into sermons, worksite chatter, late-night texts, and dinner-table debates. It became less about two men and more about a choice, a reflection of what America wanted in its leaders. And as the country moved forward, families, living workers, building students, learning the story, lingered in the background like a heartbeat. The echo of contrast remained, whispering its question to a nation still searching for its answer. Historians would later look back on the week not for the noise, but for the clarity that cut through it. In panel discussions and essays, one line emerged again and again. He didn't out-yell him, he out-truthed him. The phrasing was crisp, almost surgical, capturing the essence of what millions had witnessed in real time. It wasn't volume that endured, it was verification, the steady hand proving stronger than the clenched fist. In Boston, a historian told a packed auditorium, Trump roared like fire, but Obama responded like stone, unmoved, unbroken, undeniable. The audience erupted into applause, not because it was partisan, but because it rang with the rhythm of something timeless. Rage had burned bright, yes, but steadiness had stood taller. The lesson wasn't about 1 week in politics, but about the kind of strength that shapes legacies. Across the country, educators folded the clash into lectures on leadership. Students underlined the phrase steadiness, rage in their notebooks, the greater-than sign itself becoming a shorthand for the week's lesson. In living rooms, parents explained it the same way elders explained parables, calm as power, and power doesn't always need to scream. The story had moved beyond politics. It was now morality, a lived fable written in headlines. By the week's close, the conclusion was inescapable. Trump had given America a storm of anger, but Obama had given it a compass. And the compass always outlasts the storm. The question that lingered wasn't whether Obama had won the clash, but whether America itself had absorbed the truth at its core in the end. Is legacy defined by the rage that shakes the room or the steadiness that holds it together? History isn't shaped by shouting. it's shaped by what people choose to remember. That was the narration playing in the minds of millions as the dust settled from a week of fire and water noise and poise. Across the country, the split screen still lingered, not because it was loud, but because it revealed something raw, something undeniable. One man tried to dominate with rage, the other countered with truth, and in that clash, the measure of leadership was quietly rewritten. In homes, parents retold the story to their children, not as a partisan argument, but as a lesson in resilience. He didn't scream back, a mother explained softly, he showed proof. The children listened, their eyes wide, realizing that power could come without thunder. In factories, workers repeated the line to each other on breaks. Truth doesn't scream, turning it into something more than a meme. It became a reminder, a warning, a compass pointing away from the storm. Historians recorded it with clinical precision, but even they admitted the moment carried more than facts. Truth is fragile, one wrote. It can be buried, bent, battered by noise. But when held steady, it outlasts everything that tries to distort it. The words struck like scripture, spreading through classrooms and sermons, reframing the clash as less about two men and more about the endurance of honesty in a world drowning in volume. The emotional crescendo arrived not on television, but in the quiet spaces where people reflected on what they had seen. A grandmother in Oklahoma looked at her granddaughter and said, "Remember this, the one who shouted will fade, but the one who proved will last." In Philadelphia, a pastor told his congregation, "A storm will roar and vanish, but a steady hand leaves its mark forever." These moments didn't trend, but they settled into the soil of memory where legacies grow. Trump's fire had lit the room, but it consumed itself in the process. Obama's calm had carried like water flowing silently, but carving the stone deeper with every passing hour. The fragility of truth was laid bare, so easy to drown, under noise so vulnerable to distortion. Yet the very fact it survived this week proved it was worth fighting for, worth holding close. And perhaps that was the lesson: truth needs defenders, not in volume, but in endurance. By week's end, America had not just witnessed a clash, it had absorbed a question. In the bars and classrooms and break rooms, people spoke less about who won and more about what it meant. The story had moved beyond politics into something universal, a mirror reflecting what kind of leadership, what kind of memory a nation wants to keep. And as the final echoes of the week drifted into history, one question lingered in the silence, sharp as lightning after the storm. When the noise fades, will we remember the truth or the story told the loudest? True leadership isn't measured by who shouts the loudest, but by who steadies the storm. In life, we face people who try to dominate with noise, at work, in politics, even in our families. But history shows that calm persistence backed by truth and evidence leaves the deepest mark. For those of us over 50, we know that wisdom is not in the fire of anger, but in the clarity of action. The question we must ask ourselves is simple. When the moment comes, will we add to the noise or stand steady for the truth? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.